One.
Hi, my name is Nick Pappas. I'm a retired journalist, most recently at the Albuquerque Journal, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation on Dawson, New Mexico, once the state's largest coal mining town, and sadly, home to two of the deadliest mine disasters in U.S. history. Today's presentation is being given in partnership with the Historical Society of New Mexico's History Scholars Program, which helps fund research at state institutions on New Mexico's rich history. As such, I would like to thank the Society and its president, Henrietta Christmas, for helping with this presentation. Dawson, New Mexico. Quote, this property at Dawson is going to be one of the greatest coal properties in the country, unquote. Joe E. Sheridan, U.S. Mine Inspector, Territory of New Mexico, 1905. Given my New England roots, I knew nothing about Dawson until I arrived here in June of 2013 to accept an editor's job at the Journal. As it turns out, my arrival came only months before the 100-year anniversary of what stands today as the second worst mine disaster in American history. Not surprisingly, my newspaper, as well as the Santa Fe New Mexican, New Mexico TV stations, and other media outlets, took note to recognize this dark day in New Mexico history. The anniversary also was marked by several ceremonies and programs, including those hosted by the Dawson, New Mexico Association in Raton, St. George Greek Orthodox Church of Albuquerque, this one in remembrance of the 36 Greek immigrants who perished in the explosion, and a non-denominational graveside service at historic Dawson Cemetery. For reasons not totally clear to me at the time, I soon became captivated by the Dawson story. Over the next few years, I read as much as I could about this old mining town. Old newspaper stories, magazine articles, online personal accounts, even government documents. But it wasn't until I retired in late 2018 that I decided to take a more hands-on approach. So on a chilly January morning in 2019, I left my Albuquerque home for the 3.5-hour trip to Dawson Cemetery. Afterward, I took a prearranged tour of Dawson artifacts at the Raton Museum, courtesy of curator Roger Sanchez. By the time I started home late that afternoon, I had committed to writing a narrative account of this town's remarkable history. So what was the appeal? Yes, the two explosions that together claimed nearly 400 lives in 1913 and 1923 certainly grabbed my attention. But I soon learned there was much more to Dawson's history than those two tragic events. Consider these storylines. The story of the land that one day would become Dawson, originally part of the largest land grant in US history. The story of the European immigrants who settled in Dawson to seek a better life for themselves and their family. The story of the model mining town that Phelps Dodge and Company built along the banks of the Bermejo River. The story of the inevitable but nonetheless devastating closing of the town on short notice. The story of the chance event that led to the placement of Dawson Cemetery in the National Register of Historic Places. And, perhaps most remarkable of all, the story of the Dawson folks who have kept the spirit of this community alive for more than 70 years after its closing in 1950. Roughly 60 years before the first nugget of coal was mined here, Dawson was nothing more than a tiny speck in what would become known as the Maxwell Land Grant. In 1841, the governor of Mexico conveyed this 1.7 million acre tract of land to a Taos merchant and a government official, both Mexican citizens. The vast majority of this land would become Colfax County, the remainder Las Animas County in southern Colorado. In 1858, Lucian Maxwell, a son-in-law to one of the original owners and an associate of American frontiersman Kit Carson, purchased a controlling interest in the property. Shortly after securing ownership of the remainder, he sold it all to English investors, but not before entering into a handshake deal for a loosely defined parcel with one John Barclay Dawson. Years later, that agreement would be challenged unsuccessfully before the US Supreme Court. Bigger than life stories demand bigger than life characters, and Dawson had one in its ultimate namesake, J.B. Dawson. Pioneer, rancher, farmer, cattle driver, trailblazer, Texas Ranger, Indian fighter, patriot. One of my favorite J.B. Dawson stories is how he met his third wife, Lavinia. After tragically losing his first two wives to illness, family and friends suggested he contact a widow in Trinidad, Colorado. So Dawson boarded a stagecoach bound for her home, but he didn't get far. Not long after he left, he read an article in a Baptist magazine that had been left on board. Dawson was so impressed by what the author, an Iowa school teacher, had to say, he got off at the next stop, a mere 25 miles into his 500-mile trip, and boarded another stagecoach home. Here, using his rudimentary writing skills, he wrote a letter to this total stranger, concluding with his need for a new wife to watch over his three, quote, motherless children. They married less than a year later. Dawson's primary interest in coal after acquiring the New Mexico property was to fuel the family wood stove on those chilly New Mexico winter nights, not launch a major mining company. This, even though his 20,000 acres sat upon what was considered the most valuable coal land in the territory. Still, he did make some inroads into mining the property, well, sort of, employing one or two men to produce a paltry 300 tons of coal in fiscal year 1901, the second lowest output in the territory. By this time, Dawson already had made a name for himself as a rancher and cattle driver. On his maiden trip, he moved roughly 500 head over 2,000 treacherous miles from Arkansas to California to sell to miners during the gold rush. In 1859, he did the same when gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, blazing a trail known for a time as the Dawson Trail. Dawson would wear many hats during his lifetime, but his favorite was running his ranch in New Mexico. He so loved the land that he retained 1,200 acres for a short time after he sold the remainder to mining interests for $450,000 in 1901. The beneficiary of that sale was the Dawson Fuel Company, a subsidiary of the New Mexico Railway and Coal Company. Railroad promoter Charles Eddy, a principal of the parent company, wasted little time in building a 132-mile rail line connecting the Dawson coal fields to Tucumcari to distribute coal to in and out-of-state markets. By 1905, Dawson Fuel had constructed hundreds of homes for workers, along with coke ovens, a power plant, washery, general store, and other commercial structures. That year, a crew of 650 men were busy working 4 mines and producing 423,000 tons of coal, the most in the New Mexico territory that year. For Eddy, it was time to find a buyer. Enter Phelps Dodge & Company, a New York-based owner and operator of Arizona copper mines, desperate for a reliable stream of coke, a purer version of coal, to fuel its smelters. Phelps Dodge had a contract with John D. Rockefeller's Colorado Fuel and Iron Company to secure its coke, but periodic labor strikes and other factors convinced management it needed a supply of its own. So in May of 1905, Phelps Dodge struck a deal to acquire all of Eddy's mine and railway holdings for $16 million, the equivalent of $470 million in today's inflation-adjusted dollars. Besides Dawson Fuel, the deal included the Dawson Railway, El Paso and Northeastern Railroad, El Paso and Rock Island Railroad, and the Alamogordo Lumber Company. To call Dawson a coal camp would have been an insult. After all, how many coal camps could lay claim to a 1,000-seat opera house, the largest theater in New Mexico at the time, that also featured a ballroom, billiard hall, and a bowling alley, or a mercantile store that hosted fashion shows, sold furs, and could honestly say it sold everything from mousetraps to tractors, or a state-of-the-art hospital. And that was just a half of it. Among its other amenities were a gymnasium, athletic fields, several schools, two churches, an outdoor swimming pool, and a golf course, at the time recognized as the highest elevation course in the country at more than 6,700 feet. Like much of America, Dawson was a beneficiary of the massive wave of European immigration between 1880 and 1920 that brought 20 million people to this country. By 1910, 75% of the workers employed underground were from Europe, the vast majority Italians, Slavonians, and Greeks. Over the years, others would come from Austria, Finland, France, Germany, Great Britain, Hungary, Ireland, Poland, Scotland, Sweden, and a few other countries. As a result, more than a dozen languages were spoken at any one time, necessitating safety signs in multiple languages around the mines. Some European immigrants planned to stay for a few years, send money home to their families, then return to the old country. Others intended to remain to start a new life for themselves right here in America. It didn't take Phelps Dodge long to make a mark with its newly christened Stag Canyon Fuel Company, its Dawson subsidiary. By 1909, 4 years after acquiring the mines, full production hit 1 million tons for the first time, a level it would maintain for the next decade. In his 1911 annual report, the territorial mine inspector described Dawson in this way, quote, "The equipment of the mines and the methods employed in operation are equal to the best to be found in any coal mines," unquote. Dawson mine employment peaked in 1915 at 1,640 men and remained above 1,000 until shortly before the Black Tuesday stock market crash ushered in the Great Recession of 1929 to 1939. It would never fully recover. The risk of death and disfigurement was a fact of life for all who chose to work in the dangerous mines of America. No fewer than 1,000 men lost their lives each year between 1900 and 1945. The deadliest year on record was 1907, when U.S. mine fatalities peaked at 3,242, roughly 9 per day. That also was the year of two of the nation's worst mine disasters, occurring within weeks of each other in December. Monongah, West Virginia, with 362 deaths, and Jacobs Creek, Pennsylvania, with 239. These and later mine disasters ultimately led Congress in 1910 to create the U.S. Bureau of Mines, though its powers were limited to research and investigation, not enforcement. The next major piece of federal legislation wouldn't be passed for another 3 decades. Sadly, Dawson was not immune to this phenomenon. On October 22, 1913, shortly after 3 p.m., an unidentified miner set off an explosive while 284 men were at work inside mine number 2, a violation of both company regulations and state law. What was later determined to be an overcharged shot ignited highly flammable coal dust inside the mine, triggering a massive explosion that sent tongues of fire hundreds of feet into the sky. Responding to the emergency siren, men from the adjacent mines rushed to number 2, only to find the entrance blocked with debris. So too was the passageway that connected mine number 5 to the now smoldering mine. The only remaining option was to enter the mine through the air shaft and use the emergency ladder to reach the miners below. But that was foiled by the presence of dangerous gases that had accumulated once the main ventilation fans were knocked out by the ferocious force of the explosion. Rescuers worked frantically to clear the avalanche of coal, earth, rock, and timber that had rained down on the mine entrance, but it was a timely and painstaking process. In the end, only 23 of the 284 men inside the mine survived. The death toll of 263, which included 2 outside rescue men, is second only to the 362 men killed in Monongah in 1907. 10 years later, on February 8, 1923, tragedy struck again. This time, coal dust was ignited by an electric arc from a trolley wire or trolley feed cable after several steel mine cars derailed inside mine number 1. As was the case in 1913, women and children congregated as close to the mine entrance as permitted, praying for the safe return of their loved ones. But for most, that was not to be. Only 2 of the 122 men inside at the time of the explosion survived. Miraculously, 2 miners, a Greek and an Italian, walked out unharmed 16 hours later. "We ain't hurt," said the Italian upon exiting the mine. "How about some coffee?" Together with the 1913 explosion, Dawson holds the unwanted distinction as the only mining town in America to suffer 2 disasters of this magnitude. Technically, based on the federal government's definition of a mine disaster as the loss of 5 or more men, Dawson experienced a third in 1920. On the night of April 14, 5 men were killed when they prematurely entered the mine before the scheduled detonation of explosives by the company's electric shot firing system. Investigators later concluded that they had entered the mine early in an attempt to shave a few minutes off their workday before heading home for the evening. Dawson's decline was brought on by several factors, most beyond its control. Prime among them were the lingering impact of the Great Depression, the conversion of locomotives from coal to diesel, and labor disputes. In 1930, annual production plummeted to below 400,000 tons for the first time since Phelps Dodge acquired the mines, and by 1932, only 1 of its 10 mines was in operation. While the writing was on the wall a year earlier, Phelps Dodge announced the inevitable in early 1950. The final day of coal production would be April 28, and the town would close for good on June 30. National Iron and Metal Company of Phoenix, a salvage firm, purchased the town for $500,000 and began to sell off and dismantle it piece by piece. By early October, 4 months after its closing, there was nothing left to sell. Nearly all the homes, commercial buildings, and machinery had been purchased and shipped elsewhere. The mercantile store, for example, was taken down brick by brick by a Colorado contractor who used the materials to build homes in Raton and Trinidad. The nails and lumber from the Dawson Hotel, including its hardwood floors, were used to build a residential home in Tulia, Texas. The coal washer was taken apart and later reassembled for use in the coal fields of West Virginia. And hundreds of Dawson homes were jacked up and relocated to other communities in New Mexico and beyond. All that remained were about a dozen homes still in use by workers of the Dawson power plant that provide electricity to outside communities. "It's a little sad," said the national iron worker in charge of dismantling the town, "but I guess there was nothing else they could do." During the summer of 1990, 40 years after the closing of Dawson, brothers Dale and Lloyd Christian visited Dawson Cemetery while on a metal detecting expedition in Colfax County. The brothers expected to find the remnants of a ghost town, but they were shocked by the sight of what appeared to be an abandoned cemetery with its row upon row of white iron crosses. Said Dale, "It looked like a miniature Arlington." Dale promptly contacted New Mexico officials to inquire about the prospect of getting the cemetery listed on the National Register of Historic Places. He took measurements, shot photographs, and conducted historical research to be used in the state's official application. Despite strict criteria governing the inclusion of cemeteries, Dawson Cemetery was accepted onto the National Register on April 9, 1992. Today, more than 70 years later, the town may be no more, but the community is very much alive. The Dawson, New Mexico Association maintains an active website of history, stories, and photographs. The Dawson Facebook page boasts more than 560 members. And Every 2 years, on Labor Day weekend, hundreds of folks with ties to Dawson return to the old town site for a picnic reunion. Here, they share stories, display mementos, exchange photographs, and relive memories of what it once meant to be a Dawsonite. Nearly 450 people turned out for the most recent one in 2018, an impressive number, even if a far cry from the astonishing 1,800 that used to attend in the 1980s. And after several cancellations due to the coronavirus pandemic, the next reunion is scheduled for Labor Day weekend 2020. This brings me to the end of my presentation, one I'm afraid barely scratches the surface of this former mining town's multi-layered history. If you share my fascination with the story of Dawson, you can learn more by visiting the Dawson, New Mexico Association website, or the Dawson Facebook page that's maintained by a descendant of the town, or several Dawson-themed documentaries available online, including the award-winning Ghost Town by Emily Frazier, and Dawson Remembered by Bob Sexton, whose grandfather was among the victims of the 1913 mine explosion. As I noted at the start of this presentation, I began researching and interviewing for a narrative history of Dawson in early 2019. As part of that process, I launched a personal website dedicated to my Dawson project in March 2020 and introduced a free monthly email newsletter a few months later. And last month, my book proposal was accepted by the University of New Mexico Press with a planned publication date of 2023. In the meantime, if you or someone you know has any Dawson-related documents, letters, diaries, unpublished manuscripts, or photographs to share, please contact me at nick@nickpappasbooks.com. In closing, I again would like to thank the Historical Society of New Mexico for its support and for making this presentation possible. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching.